They called this place useless. Then the dry flume started running by itself.
Lena Ruth Calder opened the probate envelope in the cab of her broken truck because there was nowhere else to put her hands. Rain had blown in from the coast before dawn and left a skin of water on the windshield that the wipers only smeared. The heater on the passenger side was dead. The driver's door still stuck if she pulled it too hard. She had parked behind a closed feedlot outside Black Alder Bog and waited there until the paper in her lap felt heavier than the weather. The first page said what the lawyer had said in the voicemail. Her mother's estate had been settled. The Cranberry packing shed on the edge of the bog, along with the narrow access strip and footbridge, had been transferred to Lena by probate. At 23, she had expected grief. She had not expected land. The second page made the rest of it plain enough to sting. The cousins wanted the strip. The developer wanted the strip. The shed itself had been appraised as a liability, a weathered shell with no working use and too much water in the wrong places. One of her uncles had already called it useless bogwood. Another had said she should sign the access over and save everyone time. Lena folded the letter once, then again, and held it in the glove that still smelled faintly of cranberry vines. She had lost her seasonal farm job 9 days earlier after reporting a broken safety rail and a blocked drain line in the sorting shed at the neighboring operation. The foreman had told her in front of 2 pickers and a pallet jack that people who complained were always the ones who found themselves without a clock card. By the end of the week, her shift was gone, her borrowed room was gone, and she was back to sleeping on a couch in a friend's apartment with a duffel bag and an unpaid truck repair bill. The lawyer's note had one sentence at the bottom in a different hand. Do not sign any transfer paperwork until you have seen the parcel in daylight. That was the sentence that kept her from crumpling the page. She looked through the rain at the wet road, then at the old access map on the seat beside her, then started the truck. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. The road into Black Alder Bog narrowed after the last farmhouse. On one side, drainage ditches held black water under a skim of leaves. On the other, cranberry beds stretched under a low October sky, the vines already turning dark and flat after harvest. The footbridge to the shed was visible only when she was close enough to see the line of cedar posts and the sag in the middle. Beyond it, the shed sat low against the bog edge, half hidden by reeds and a stand of scrub pine that leaned with the wind. It looked smaller than the map had suggested and worse than the cousins had described. The roof had split near the ridge and patched itself into a crooked line of old tin and newer tar. The siding was weathered pine gone silver at the edges. One corner of the loading bay had settled enough to leave a gap under the door. The north footbridge had rotted at 2 plank joins, and the bog water below, it moved with the dark patience of something that knew how to wait out a structure. Lena killed the truck and sat with both hands on the wheel. Her mother, Ruth Calder, had brought her here once when she was 13. Not to play, to watch. Ruth had walked the planks with a clipboard tucked under one arm pointed at the screens, the scale office, the hand crank gate, and the old flume inside the shed, then said, "You remember the difference between a thing that looks finished and a thing that is finished." At the time, Lena had only remembered the smell. Wet cedar, cold iron, cranberry skins, and salt blowing in from the marsh. Now the scent drifted back from the open window as she climbed out. The footbridge groaned under her boots. She tested every plank with the shovel handle from the truck bed because the worst mistakes in her life had started with assuming wood was more honest than it was. The bridge held though it dipped once near the center and sent a cold line up her calves. On the far side, cranberry stems clung to the rails and to her pant legs. The loading bay door hung crooked in its track, and a strip of faded blue chalk on the wall read, "Scale Office" in her mother's hand. Something in her chest tightened at the sight of it. She slipped inside. The air was damp and stale with the iron smell of old bolts and the sour sweetness of fruit that had lived too close to weather for too long. The center of the shed held the dry sorting flume, a long wooden channel that should have been empty this late in the year. Screens leaned against the east wall. The scale office sat to the west, a cramped box with a counter, a ledger shelf, and a window over the bog. The rear water box was still in place, though one of the pipes leading out of it had gone loose and dropped under the floor. The place looked tired, but not dead. Lena set her bag down by the scale office door and opened the hand crank gate just enough to see the linkage beneath it. No pump power, no electric feed, no reason for water to be moving anywhere inside the shed. She knelt to check the flume and found it dry except for one dark line where the wood had soaked up old moisture and never lost the stain. Then a thin ribbon of water appeared at the top of the channel. At first, she thought it was runoff from the roof seam. But the roof above her was not dripping. The water came from deeper inside the system, moving along the flume in a clean, narrow run, as if something off-screen had opened a valve one careful notch. Lena stared. The ribbon gathered speed, touched the bottom of the flume, and slid toward her in a straight line. No wider than her thumb. No pump. No hose. No one in the shed but her. The water did not splash. It ran like it had remembered an old job and intended to finish it. She stood so fast her knee hit the counter. Outside, a truck door slammed in the yard, and she heard a voice call her name. Mara Pike, Lena muttered, recognizing the voice before the woman stepped into the doorway. Mara Pike was 62 if she was a day all sharp weather and blunt honesty, with a town clerk coat buttoned to the throat and a waterproof folder under one arm. She stopped at the threshold, took one look at the wet floor line, and followed Lena's eyes to the flume. "Don't tell me that's supposed to be dry," Mara said. It was Lena answered. Mara set the folder on the office counter and looked at the hand crank gate, then the lean of the bridge, then the water still moving down the channel. She did not smile. That was better. Mara was a woman who believed in facts before wonder. "You signed nothing today," she said. "Not the access strip, not the shed, not a word your cousins put in front of you." Lena looked at her. "You already know about that. I know about developers, and I know about people who call a place worthless when they want it cheap." Mara tapped the folder once. "Your mother did not keep this parcel for the view." She felt it touch the edge of one rubber sole and did not move. Mara glanced towards the rear of the shed where the footbridge wind came through the boards in a low, hollow sound. If that flume is moving with no power, then something's wrong or something's hidden. Either way, you don't let the county talk you out of seeing it in daylight. Lena bent slowly and watched the ribbon of water thin as it crossed the wooden channel, the line bright against the old grain. The shed had not answered her yet, but it had begun. The footbridge gave under Lena's boots with a slow, tired flex that told her more than any appraisal form ever could. She stood still for a moment, one hand on the side rail, and let the bridge settle. Bog water moved beneath the planks in a dark channel threaded with red stems and a skin of reflected sky. The wind had risen enough to push the reeds at the edge of the access strip, flat in one direction, then let them spring back. Every sound around the shed seemed dampened by the marsh, as if the place had learned to speak only when necessary. Mara Pike was already halfway to the loading bay folder under one arm, boots clean, in a way that suggested she had known to bring better footwear than Lena had. "Don't trust the outer planks," she said over her shoulder. "The center ones held last week. That doesn't mean they'll hold tomorrow." Lena tested the bridge rail with the shovel handle and followed her at a distance of 2 boards. The shed looked worse from the side. The loading bay door had dropped in its frame enough to leave a crooked seam near the latch. One screen rack leaned against the wall as if it had given up and slid there by mistake. The stone drain at the east edge was packed with mud cranberry stems and one strip of gray foam that had blown in from somewhere farther inland. No one had bothered to make the place look abandoned. It had simply been abandoned long enough for weather to do the rest. Inside the scale office, the air held the smell of old paper, damp cedar, and iron dust. Lena found a ledge of shelf space still dry enough for her bag and set it down carefully. Mara spread the county folder on the counter and pointed at the map. "Your access strip runs from here," she said, tracing a line with one blunt finger to the bridge. "The shed and the narrow footpath around the water box. If you sign that strip away, the parcel becomes useless to you and useful to somebody else." Lena folded her arms. "My cousin said I'd be lucky to get anything for it." "They want to be lucky at your expense." That was the kind of answer Lena had not known she still needed. She followed Mara back into the shed proper. The central sorting flume cut through the floor from rear to front like a dry wooden trough laid into the building's spine. Screens leaned in the east rack, warped but intact. The scale itself sat beside the office wall, a rusted platform with a tear lever that should have moved easily and did not. Beyond it, the hand crank gate hung in place near the rear water box, the linkage exposed beneath a strip of half-peeled metal. Lena crouched by the flume and touched the dry wood. It was colder than she expected. "You'll want the roof first," Mara said. "Then the bridge. Then the drain. Water's always the first thing that tells the truth." "I know." Mara looked at her, then down at the flume line. "Your mother knew, too. She used to pull the stems out of the drain before she opened the gate in the morning." Lena looked up. "You knew her well, enough to know she didn't keep this shed because it was pretty." The remark might have stung if it had been said by someone else. From Mara, it sounded like a fact with a coat of respect on it. They heard a truck door slam outside. Lena turned toward the loading bay just in time to see two men come off the road at the far side of the bridge. Her cousins Colin and Drew Calder were both in dark jackets, and both had the same expression of annoyed patience worn by men who assumed the world should have finished the hard part before they arrived. Colin held a coffee cup. Drew carried a rolled paper tube. "Still here," Colin called. Lena did not answer. Drew stopped at the loading bay threshold and looked past her into the shed. "You really came alone." Mara Pike stepped forward before Lena did. "She's not alone. She has a town clerk, a county map, and a parcel that doesn't belong to your plans." Colin gave a quick laugh. "Plans, it's a bog shed." "It's land with a legal access strip," Mara said. "That means more than you think." Drew tapped the paper tube against his boot. "The developer can work around a little strip if the owner is reasonable." Lena's hands went cold. "The owner is me." "Then be reasonable," Colin said, and tried to make it sound like a kindness. She thought of the broken rail at the harvest shed, the foreman's voice. The empty room after her shift was cut. Reasonable had been the word used by people who did not have to carry the cost. Mara turned to the brothers. "The parcel doesn't need your help becoming someone else's project." "It needs money," Colin said. "It needs water control and a roof patch," Lena answered. Drew looked almost amused. "That's not how properties get saved." "No," Lena said. "It's how they stay in one piece long enough to matter." That shut him up for a beat. The wind pushed through the loading bay and rattled the screen rack. Lena turned away from her cousins before either of them could recover and went to the rear water box. The old housing sat under a lower section of roof boxed in by boards darkened from years of damp. A pipe ran out of it and under the floor toward the flume. The line should have been dry. Instead, a faint, wet thread showed along the side of the board where water had tracked from somewhere she could not yet see. She knelt and followed it with her finger. The trail led not from the box itself, but from a seam in the floor beside the scale office wall, a place hidden by the counter and half concealed by the rusted platform. No one had called attention to it. No one had had reason to. The shed had been built to move fruit and count weight, not to hide anything. But the seam looked newer than the surrounding wood. Lena stood and leaned over the scale. The tear lever had a small crescent of fresh wear at the joint, the kind made by repeated motion. She touched it, and the lever moved farther than it should have. A narrow panel at the base of the counter shifted inward with a tiny metallic click. Mara saw it at once. "Don't pull yet." Lena froze. The panel had opened a finger width enough to show darkness behind the scale housing and the edge of a wrapped object laid flat inside the cavity. Not a bundle. Not a box. Something slim, protected, and placed with care. Her chest tightened. Her mother's initials were scratched faintly on the inside lip of the panel, RC. Mara looked from the initials to Lena's face and then toward the loading bay where Colin and Drew had gone quiet in the doorway, suddenly alert in the way people become when a thing they thought would be ordinary has turned into evidence. That Mara said is why you don't sign anything today. Lena kept her eyes on the hidden slot behind the scale and felt the whole shed change around that one narrow opening. The flume remained dry for the moment, but the thin line of water in the floor seam had not disappeared. It had only started to matter. Lena did not reach for the hidden panel at once. She stood with one hand on the scale counter and listened to the shed as if it might tell her whether the opening had happened by mistake. Rain ticked faintly on the roof seam. The water line in the floor seam below the counter held its shape for one breath, then slid another inch toward the flume. Mara Pike was already on one knee beside the scale office wall, examining the narrow gap with the focus of someone reading a public record. "Your mother marked this place," she said, "not the outside, the inside." Lena swallowed. "How can you tell?" "Because people who keep something for years don't make a hidden panel without a reason." Drew, still in the loading bay, started to speak, then stopped when Colin touched his arm. They had the look of men who wanted the language to stay legal and were irritated by the way the room kept becoming specific. Lena knelt and looked into the opening. The cavity behind the scale counter was shallow, lined with dry wood and wrapped in old wax paper that had gone soft at the edges but not failed. A thin brass plate sat at the top like a stop. It was not large enough for valuables, not if valuables meant money. It was just large enough for documents, a note, and something tied flat beneath them. The first thing she saw was a tin token, greened and corroded, pressed into the paper like a coin in a hand. The stamp on one side read R.C. Ruth Calder. Lena's throat tightened hard enough to hurt. Mara did not touch anything. She only lifted her phone and took photos from 3 angles, then handed the phone to Lena so Lena could hold it steady for the next one. That was her way. No drama, no rescue, just proof. The second layer was a folded packet of root cards tied with faded blue string. The top card showed 3 names in pencil, one of them crossed out and written again with a different pickup time. Below that, a note in Ruth's handwriting read, "If the flume runs dry, check the scale side before the water box." Lena stared at the line until the words blurred. The packet also held a thin ledger strip, a calibration note, and one rectangle of paper folded into fourths. She did not open that one yet. Something about the way it was tucked flat, the way it had been handled, made her think of careful work and not accidental hiding. Mara pointed at the floor seam. "The wet line is probably feeding from this side." Lena shifted her weight and looked again at the flume. The dry wooden channel ran from rear to front through the center of the shed, its boards darker in the middle where old water had once flowed and left a stain. Near the rear gate, a small metal linkage sat under the hand crank mechanism. The gate was half lowered already, which she had not noticed before. She touched it, and the linkage moved with a scratch of rust. The water line in the seam below the counter thickened at once. Not enough to flood. Enough to matter. A narrow ribbon of water began to appear along the seam and slip toward the flume from the hidden side of the scale office wall, where the old wood met the stone drain channel beneath the floor. Mara watched the movement and nodded once as if the building had confirmed her suspicion. "There's still live flow in the old channel," she said. "Not from power. From the bog side and the gate alignment." Colin barked a short laugh from the doorway. "So the shed is leaking and you call that a clue?" Mara turned her head just enough to make him stop talking. "I call it a system." Drew folded his arms. "A system that still won't cover the access strip." Lena looked up from the cavity. "You came to say that again." "We came to be practical," Colin said. "Practical for who?" The answer did not come. She set the token down on the counterpad and reached for the folded rectangle at the back of the cavity. It was wrapped in one layer of oilcloth and tied with a single loop of twine. The moment she touched it, she felt how dry and protected it had been kept. Not buried. Hidden. Preserved. The packet pulled free with a soft scrape. Beneath it, the narrow slot ended in an old wood lip carved with 2 initials and a date. R.C. Hate. The year Lena turned 4. She looked at the initials, then at the packet, then at the flume. Mara read her face before she said anything. "Open the note." Lena unwrapped the folded rectangle with clumsy fingers. Inside was a letter short enough to fit on one side of a recipe card written in her mother's hand. "Lena, if you are reading this, then the shed did what I hoped it would do and kept one thing dry long enough to matter." The first line made her stop. The rest said the developer would not find value in the land until the access strip and the old root records were separated from the shed. Ruth had kept the calibration note, the picker receipts, and the wage ledger here because the scale office never flooded as badly as the loading bay, and because people looked where they expected money and not where they expected proof. The note ended with a sentence Lena had to read twice. "Do not sell the strip before you know whose work built it." Lena folded the card back on itself and held it in both hands. The shed did not feel empty anymore. It felt assigned. She looked at Mara. She hid records. Mara nodded. And probably for a reason you don't want to guess before you see the rest. Lena set the letter down beside the token and reached for the route cards. One listed the North Bog pickers by crew number. Another had a split delivery time marked in red pencil, the kind a foreman would use if he wanted the day's work paid by weight, but not by dignity. A third card showed the school route turnoff and the old side path by the ditch. The names were enough to change the air in the room. One of the names belonged to Sophia Reyes. Lena looked up. Sophia works the town greenhouse now. Mara's expression shifted a little. Her mother was on your mother's crew. She was, Sophia said from the doorway behind Colin's voice, quiet and steady. Lena had not heard her come in. She was carrying a canvas bag with dry paper sleeves, the kind someone brought when they expected records to be handled properly. And my aunt was too. Her eyes went to the token, then to the letter, then to the route cards. She did not touch anything. She only stood there and let the room settle. The power of the hidden slot was not in what it contained alone. It was in how quickly the shed had turned from a weathered shell into a witness. Lena looked back toward the flume and saw the thin water line moving a little faster now, not because anything supernatural had happened, but because the gate and seam had finally lined up with the old channel the way they were meant to. Water that had been stored in the bog edge and behind the wall was finding its path through the system. She could see the logic of it now. The dry flume was not really dry. It was waiting for the correct pressure. The room remained quiet except for the rain on the roof seam. Colin broke that quiet first. So what, there are old papers in the wall, and now the place has sentimental value, Nolina said. She picked up the letter, the token, and the route cards one at a time and laid them on the counter in a clean row. Then she looked at her cousins. Mara gave a single short nod, the kind that meant a clerk had seen enough to know the next step. Lena stood there with Ruth's initials in the panel, lipped the token in front of her and the ribbon of water feeding the flume from a seam no one had bothered to explain. Behind the loading bay, the bog water moved slow and dark against the footbridge supports. The shed had begun to speak in the only language it trusted. Paper, water, weight. Lena did not open the rest of the packet in front of her cousins. She carried the token, the route cards, the letter, and the calibration note to Mara Pike's office at the edge of town because the shed had gone quiet in a way that made the papers feel louder. Mara's office was warm, smelled faintly of dust and copier toner, and had a kettle that was always on the point of being useful. Sophia Reyes was already there with her canvas bag on the chair and a stack of clean sleeves laid out on the desk like a small hospital for paper. Bon had come too, though he said nothing at first. He only took one look at the route cards and nodded as if the shape of the records had confirmed what he had expected from the hidden cavity. Mara cleared the desk and spread the documents out with the care of someone handling a deed that could still be argued over. She did not ask permission to read the first line. She only looked at Lena once and said, "Now we see what your mother meant." The calibration note came first. It was short, technical, and written in Ruth Calder's firm hand. Adjust the tear lever before opening the gate. If the flume starts dry, the seam is blocked. Keep the counterweight housing sealed unless you need the route records. Do not let the cousins take the strip before the ledger is copied. Lena read that line twice. You knew about the cousins, she asked, though the answer was already in the note. Mara slid the next page over. She knew people. That's not the same thing. The route cards were older than the note. Some were stapled, some clipped, some handwritten in pencil on stock cards that had gone soft at the corners. They named cruise routes, times, and pickup points across the bog edge and the North Road turnoff. The Flume and Scale office had not just sorted fruit, they had sorted labor. One card listed 2 pickers, 1 teenage runner, and a second stop added after a rain delay. Another recorded a crew number and a late afternoon return so that the weigh-in could happen before the light failed. Sophia leaned in when she saw one of the names. That's my aunt. Her voice did not shake. It just lowered. Lena looked at the card again. The note beside the crew line was not about fruit. It was about pay. Short by half a crate at North Shed. Hold until checked. No one leaves unpaid. No one leaves unpaid. The words sat in the room longer than any argument. Bon took the route cards by the edge and fanned them carefully. There's a record system in this, not just a packing route. Mara tapped the token once. Your mother marked the hidden slot with the initials. She meant somebody to find it after the shed got cold enough to lie about itself. The letter was next. Lena opened it at last. Ruth's handwriting was slower there than in the ledger notes, but no less deliberate. Lena, if I hid this wrong, then I hid it with enough patience to make somebody angry, and that may have been necessary. The first sentence made Sophia glance up. Ruth wrote that the shed had belonged to the bog roots as much as it belonged to the family. The access strip, the footbridge, and the water box were the only reasons the crew could keep the southern beds from drying too early or flooding too hard. The developer would call the land unproductive because people like that only count what can be fenced. Ruth had spent years counting something else. Wages shortages, late harvest days, and the quiet ways families were cheated when nobody bothered to write numbers down. Lena felt Ben watching her read, but he did not interrupt. The letter went on to say that the hidden cavity behind the scale office held the proof of what the shed had done. Ruth had tucked the ledger calibration note receipt copies and route cards there because the shed stayed drier on that side and because the scale office was where people looked only for weights, never for records. She had used the hidden slot to protect a record of unpaid or short-paid work until enough of it could be gathered to matter. Mara made a soft noise under her breath that might have been anger or respect. Then came the line that changed the room. If they call this place worthless, let them call it that after they read the names. Lena stopped. The names were not in the letter. They were in the ledger pages that followed. She had not yet opened them fully, but the top pages were enough to show columns of pickers' wages short counts and handwritten corrections in Ruth's hand. Some lines were crossed out and written again. Some ended with a note that the missing amount was paid from the root fund. Others carried a date and the initials of the person corrected. No line looked like treasure. Every line looked like a labor restored to someone who had earned it. Sophia pressed her hand to the edge of the desk and stared at one page long enough to read her own family number in the margin. My mother said this. She'd kept them from being cheated, she said. I thought she meant the scale. She meant the whole route, Mara answered. Lena looked from the ledger to the token, then back to the letter. The shed had not been hiding wealth. It had been hiding proof. That was worse news for the cousins and better news for everyone else. There was another paper folded beneath the letter. A deed strip map old enough to have been copied from a town survey and marked in pencil with the access line. The footbridge, the water box, and a notation across the western edge that Lena had to read twice to understand. No separate transfer without parcel consent. Her stomach tightened. This is why they wanted the strip. Yes, Mara said. Because if the strip goes, the records become harder to reach, and the shed becomes easier to clear. Bun took the map and held it flat against the desk. That's enough to slow the county if we file it right. Lena did not answer him. She was still reading her mother's last paragraph. You do not owe the cousins the land just because they were loud first. If you keep anything, keep the strip, the shed, and the people who can prove the work was real. Give the letter to Mara if you need help with the filing. Give the token to Sophia if she asks for a copy. And if they try to tell you that a hidden record is just old paper, remind them that old paper is how poor people survived the people with money. The last sentence was underlined once. Lena folded the letter carefully and set it back beside the token. The room was quiet for several beats. Not empty quiet. The kind that comes after a fact has landed and nobody wants to cheapen it by speaking too fast. Mara reached for the county folder on the shelf. We can file the deed map, the route records, and a preservation hold before your cousins turn this into a sale notice. Colin and Drew had not followed them in. That delay did not mean safety. It only meant they were waiting for the easiest version of the story to harden. You want copies? Sophia nodded once. For the families, not the developers. Mara was already opening a fresh sleeve packet. Ben set the calibration note under the lamp and began photographing the margin marks. Lena stood between them and felt the shed's work shift in her chest from secret to responsibility. Outside rain moved across the windows in thin gray threads. Inside the names came first. The roof patch went on in the rain because waiting another day would have let more water through the split seam. Bun brought a tarp, a coil of builder's twine roofing screws, and a strip of flashing cut from a salvaged panel in his truck bed. Mara climbed the north side of the footbridge to brace the ladder while he worked the roof edge. Sophia stood under the loading bay and passed tools up when asked, then stopped asking if the rain would let up. It would not have mattered if it had. Lena held the tarp edge where Ben pointed and kept her boots balanced on the wet plank joint that had looked dangerous from the beginning. The shed's corrugated roof had a long split near the ridge, and water had been finding the crack long enough to stain the floor around the rear water box. Ben laid the flashing over the seam, drove screws through the high points, and folded the tarp to push runoff away from the center line. "Don't over-tighten it," he said. "You want the water moving, not trapped." Lena copied the motion on the other side while rain rolled off the tarp in a dark sheet. The roof did not look repaired. It looked less ready to fail. That was enough for one afternoon. Below them, Mara Pike measured the water path with a finger along the stone drain and called up the drains still blocked on the east edge. "If the overflow stays there, it'll keep feeding the seam." "Then we clear it," Lena said. That was the first time she heard herself answer the shed like it needed her. Sophia found a rake in the loading bay and pulled cranberry stems, mud, and 2 broken twigs out of the stone channel while the others held the tarp line. The drain opened slowly. Water stopped collecting against the wall and started moving toward the bog ditch the way it was supposed to. Nothing dramatic happened. No collapse, no reveal, no miraculous drying. The shed simply stopped taking on water in one place that mattered. Bun climbed down, looked at the runoff line, and nodded once. "Good," he said. "Now it can keep being old without becoming worse." Mara spread the papers across her office desk under the lamp and made Lena do the filing in the right order. The root cards went into sleeves first because they were the working record. The wage ledger followed, but only after each page was photographed and logged by source page count and condition. The calibration note was treated like a mechanical record. Ruth's letter stayed in a separate sleeve marked Family Correspondence. The deed strip map got its own copy because the original would have more legal weight if preserved clean. Sophia sat at the desk edge and wrote family names beside the crew numbers without changing the spelling. That mattered. Names carried more than identification in a place like this. They carried proof that someone had worked, returned, and been counted. On one ledger page, a column of shorted weights had been corrected in Ruth's hand with a note that read, "Hold the difference. Pay by root fund. No one leaves owing what the weather took." Lena stared at the line for a long time. It was not charity language. It was accounting language used by a person who knew exactly who got squeezed when the season went bad. "My mother said the shed kept them honest," Sophia murmured. "Your mother was right," Mara said. They boxed the public copies in clear sleeves and left the private family letters in a smaller envelope. The difference between public record and private grief felt important enough to respect. Mara wrote a label on the archival box and handed the pencil to Lena. "Put your initials on the inventory line," she said. Lena did and found the motion steadier than she expected. Colin and Drew came back before dusk with the kind of confidence that only survives in men who think a legal map is a suggestion. They did not enter the shed at first. They stood by the loading bay door with their coats still damp and their developer packet rolled tight between them like a baton. Mara met them on the threshold, folder in hand, while Ben stayed inside the office and Sophia remained behind the counter with the records box. Colin spoke first. "We're still prepared to make this easy." "By easy, you mean cheap," Mara said. Drew looked past her to Lena. "You can keep the shed if you sign the strip." Lena shook her head once. Colin's patience thinned. "The land's not doing you any favors. It's bog edge. It's maintenance. It's an old shell with no commercial future." Mara slid the deed strip map out of the folder and laid it flat on the counter between them. "Then you won't mind reading the notation near the west boundary." Drew's eyes moved to the line, then stopped. No separate transfer without parcel consent. The silence that followed had a shape to it. "We were not told that before," Colin said. "You were told enough to be dangerous," Mara replied. "Not enough to be right." Lena stepped forward. "The access strip stays with the parcel." Drew's expression hardened into annoyance. "And if we challenge that, you can challenge a map," Mara said. "You can't challenge the names in the ledger without showing your own work." That landed because it had to. The route records and wage sheets were already copied and indexed. The county would have to look at them if the matter went public. Colin saw that first. Drew saw it a second later and looked offended by the delay. Lena expected a fight. Instead, Colin took one step back, then another, and said, "This is going to cost everybody." "No," Lena said. "It already did." They left without slamming the door, which felt almost worse. It meant they believed there was still room to bargain later. She would have to make sure there wasn't. Mara closed the folder and looked at Lena. "File the map tonight. If the cousins want a hearing, give them a hearing. But don't let them move the strip first." Lena nodded. Bun opened the separator housing again after the rain eased and the roof patch had held through 1 full hour of runoff. The wheel sat still now. No false turn, no lazy motion from the split coupling. He touched the shaft and confirmed that the repaired section no longer shifted under thermal pressure. The machine looked the same from the outside, but the hidden misalignment had been corrected. "Good enough for a test run," he said. Lena knelt beside him while he removed the last loose grit from the bore. Inside the rear chase, the old alignment marks were visible on the panel lip, and the narrow cavity behind the scale office still held the dry edge of the slot where Ruth had hidden the records. The place felt less secret than before, more like a compartment in a machine that had served a purpose larger than itself. Bun pointed to the cleaned housing. "This is what I meant about water and structure. A lot of the problem wasn't the machine. It was where water had been allowed to sit." Lena looked toward the flume and then back to the housing. "And if we fix the floor, then the rest becomes ordinary maintenance." She almost smiled. Ordinary maintenance sounded like a future. Sophia came in with the last sleeve box and set it on the office shelf under Mara's label. "County's going to ask for proof the place still has a use," she said. It was the first time she had said it like a statement instead of a hope. Bun packed his tools and nodded toward the water box. "Tomorrow, we clean the line, clear the bridge again, and see whether the flume can carry a small flow without backing up." Lena placed her palm on the counter edge and felt the shed settle around the work ahead. The roof no longer leaked at the seam. The records were boxed and copied. The strip map was ready for filing. The cousins had not won. They had only learned the fight would take longer. That was enough for one night. They braced the north footbridge first because Lena had finally learned that a place cannot be repaired from the center outward if the way in keeps lying. Bun brought cedar blocks, a pry bar, a box of new screws, and a roll of orange survey tape. Sophia carried a thermos and a bundle of dry shop towels. Mara Pike arrived with a city-issued flashlight and the tired patience of someone who had already filed too many temporary holds for 1 week. The bog wind had a wet edge to it, and each plank on the bridge shuddered underfoot with its own small complaint. "Step where I step," Ben said. Lena did. He tested the bridge with a shovel handle, one board at a time, then marked the worst soft spots with chalk. 2 planks near the middle had gone so thin they sounded hollow under the handle. One rail post leaned enough to make the whole span seem to tilt toward the water. Sophia held the end of the tape while Ben replaced the worst plank and packed cedar shims under a sagging join. Mara read the old access map and pointed to the strip where the bridge needed a safe line for the county to respect the parcel as useful. "That one stays," she said. "If the access breaks, they'll call the whole thing abandoned again." Lena knelt to drive a screw, careful not to over-torque it. The wood took the fastener cleanly. It was a small thing, but the bridge stopped talking under her weight after that. Not silent, just honest. "That's better," she said. "Better is enough," Ben answered. "Nobody should promise more to rotten wood." The line made Sophia laugh, though not loudly. The bridge took the extra load when Lena stepped back across it and held without the harsh dip from before. She felt the difference in her knees and in the air around the shed. Access was no longer a guess. It was becoming a fact. Once the bridge held, the drain had a chance to matter. They spent the next hour at the east stone channel with gloved hands, a trowel, and a hooked length of wire bent for pulling debris from the seam. Mud came out first, then cranberry stems, then a wedge of root mat so thick it had turned black in the center. Water moved a little when the blockage loosened, then stopped again until Ben cleared the lower lip with a flat scraper and Lena dragged out the last sticky bundle by hand. The stone channel opened all at once. A thin run of water slipped down the line, not much at first, just enough to show the path was still alive. It moved under the loading bay past the scale office wall and away toward the bog ditch where it belonged. The roof tarp stopped feeding the same spot. The wet line near the rear seam faded. Lena stood with both hands on her knees and watched the drain behave itself. That was the whole argument, Mara said. What was? Water. It always was. Mara tapped the Flume sideboard with one knuckle. Now the Flume can run without pretending to be a storm. Bun opened the hand crank gate halfway and let Lena work the lever back and forth until the linkage moved without grinding. The old mechanism needed no force, only alignment. The same was true of half the problems in the shed. She lifted the gate and felt the wooden Flume answer with a low, damp hush as water entered the channel in a controlled line. The dry sorting Flume was no longer dry, not because a pump had come alive, because the shed had remembered how to direct what the bog already timid. Sophia set the sleeves of copied records on the office counter, while Lena watched the water thread down the channel. Every movement in the building now had a paper twin: the route cards, the ledger, the calibration note, the deed map, the bridge work, the drain clearing. Nothing had to stay a guess if she wrote it down. That thought made her stand taller than she had all week. The first small sorting run happened at dawn, 2 days later, before the wind came up and before the cousins could find a new argument. It was not a harvest day in the grand sense. Just one crate from a neighboring bog, and a few bags of cranberries set aside by a cooperative grower who trusted Mara more than he trusted the county. Ben wanted the machine tested under a real load. Sophia wanted the records tied to an actual use. Lena wanted proof that the shed could still do one honest thing without breaking. They carried the crate over the bridge in silence. The planks held. Inside the shed, the water box was filled just enough for the gate to move the flow, and the Flume shivered faintly as the first water entered the channel. Ben stood at the scale with one hand on the tare lever. Mara watched the line of the drain. Sophia held the ledger open on the office counter, ready to note weight and route. Lena set the crate at the mouth of the sorting floor and tipped the cranberries into the Flume. They moved, not fast, not theatrically, just cleanly, with the wet red fruit rolling along the wooden channel, while the water carried stems and leaves toward the lower screen. The sound was small, a soft rush and a faint clack where berries struck the old guide slats. Ben nodded once when the flow stayed level. Mara nodded when the drain kept pace. Sophia wrote the weight down and did not need to ask anyone if the number mattered. It did. The scale held. The Flume did not back up. No board buckled. No seam burst. The shed had become what it had once been, a place where work moved in order. Lena felt the relief of that in her chest before she felt the pride. A second crate followed. Then another half box. Not enough to call it a production day. Enough to prove the route still lived in the building. Enough to prove the records were not only history. Enough to give the county something harder to dismiss than a memory. Bun wiped his hands on a rag and looked at Lena across the Flume. "That's your first clean run." Lena glanced at the moving berries and the wet line of water under the channel. "It's smaller than I thought it would be." "Everything useful is," Mara said. Sophia closed the ledger after the third entry and tucked the pen behind her ear. "And it still counts." The county review came that afternoon. Mara had filed the deed map, the route record copies, the preservation photos, and the first run log before lunch. That was the only reason the board agreed to come out again so soon. They wanted proof that the shed was more than old timber and a stubborn young woman. They wanted public use. They wanted a reason not to clear the access strip. So Lena gave them one. The inspector arrived in a gray coat with wet cuffs and a folder that was already too thin for the day. Mara stood beside the office desk and laid out the documents in a line route: cards, wage ledger, copies, calibration note, deed, strip map, first run log, and the photo sequence of the repaired bridge and drain. Ben waited near the separator wall, arms folded, while Sophia kept the archive sleeves aligned by date. The inspector flipped through the pages more slowly than Lena had expected. Not because the papers were complicated, because they were specific. Specific enough to make a clean story impossible. "These records show route support," he said. "They show work," Sophia answered before anyone else could. Mara pointed to the note Ruth had left about the access strip. "And they show why the strip matters. If the strip goes, the shed stops functioning as a route-based packing site." The inspector looked toward the flume where the berries from the first run still clung against the screen in a wet red line. He looked at the bridge outside, then back at the ledger. "And this use is current." Bunn answered first. "It was used this morning, small run, safe flow, no structural failure." That mattered more than argument. The board had asked for public use, and the shed had just given it to them in the language they understood working proof. The inspector made one note, then another. Colin and Drew did not arrive with the county. Maybe someone had told them the day was no longer easy. Maybe they had finally learned that a line on a map can become a wall when enough names are on the other side of it. Lena did not care which. What mattered was the sentence Mara read aloud at the end of the meeting after the inspector had finished and before he closed his folder. "Temporary hold remains," she said. "Access strip stays with the parcel pending stewardship review." Lena held still until the words settled. Then she let herself breathe. The shed was not safe forever. It was not transformed into a dream place or a museum or a win. But the county had stopped treating it like a disposable shell. The records were public enough to defend. The route had witnesses. The water moved correctly through the flume. That was the work she had inherited. That was enough to keep. The first official sorting day came in mid-November under a hard, clear light that made every wet plank and every red berry look newly named. Lena unlocked the shed before sunrise. The bridge held. The drain ran clean. The flume waited with the water box aligned, and the hand-crank gate set halfway just as Ben had marked it. Sophia arrived with the archive sleeves and a fresh box of labels. Mara brought the final stewardship packet under her arm. Bunn came last with a small repair kit and the look of a man who trusted a machine only after it had earned the right. No one spoke much while they worked. There was nothing left to prove in the loud way. Lena fed the first crate into the flume. The berries moved cleanly as they had 2 days earlier, but now the run felt steadier, as if the shed had accepted the day and the day had accepted the shed. Water carried the stems down the channel and through the screen. The scale caught the weight. Sophia wrote it down. Mara checked the root column. Ben watched the drain and nodded when the flow stayed true. By the second crate, Lena could hear the difference between tension and use. At noon the county packet came back approved. Not as triumph, as permission. A seasonal stewardship plan. Limited cooperative use. Protected access strip. Archive shelf in the scale office. No separate transfer. No quick sale. No stripping the shed off the route that had made it matter. Mara read the page once and set it down carefully. "It stays," she said. Lena looked at the flume, then the bridge, then the office shelf where the ledger sleeves sat in their boxes. Her mother's initials were still inside the hidden slot, but now they had a place to live beyond secrecy. The token went into the archive envelope. The letter stayed folded. The route card stayed copied and labeled. The shed had not given up its past. It had only become willing to share the part that could keep people fed and counted. Liver. Mara signed the final permit and closed the folder with a soft thump. Lena stood in the center of the shed and listened to the water moving through the flume. Outside the bog wind brushed the reeds flat and let them rise. Inside the cranberries gathered against the screen, while clean water kept moving through the repaired flume, and Lena knew the place by a different name now. Not ruin.